Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special session on Africa at the Berlin Security Conference. And today we're talking about turning Africa's climate security risks into opportunities. And we have a wonderful panel to engage this topic, and we are looking forward, of course, to all of the folk who are joining us to also engage in the discussion. Please feel free to use the chat line, and at a session later on in the program, we're going to see how much of your comments and questions can be accommodated, and we're looking forward to a really great discussion. But just to kick off, we are a month away, in fact, a couple of weeks away, from what several of us on the African continent are calling the Africa COP. COP27 will be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt under the Egyptian presidency in literally days from now, and we are looking forward to this event. We also are talking about a continent that contributes very little to the global greenhouse gas emissions, with some exceptions, of course, the likes of South Africa, but in general, the continent as a whole contributes less than 4% of the GHGs, and yet it is that continent that has generally the highest vulnerability in the world. We have been at the mercy of extreme weather events in recent times. We have seen the knock-on effects of those extreme weather events, whether they're localized and immediate, like floods, or more generalized over a region over much longer periods of time, like droughts, have had enormous impacts already on the socioeconomic status of the continent. And as the UN the AU Peace and Security Council acknowledged in November last year, it has impacts on the security status of the continent as well. So our wonderful panel today is going to examine some of these issues, hopefully in a fair amount of detail. And we will, at the end of this, have a much more composed picture of not only what the nature of the risks are, but also are there elements of solution inside those current risks that will help us on a sustainable development pathway? So colleagues, without further ado, I'm going to turn to the first of our speakers, and that is Ngozi Amu from UNOWAS. And welcome to you, ma'am. It's wonderful to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Des again, and I'm really delighted to be on this excellent panel. I work for the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel, UNOWAS. It's a regional political office covering 17 countries. And I wanted to emphasize that our mandate is conflict prevention. So this is the angle that we take when we are looking at climate change and security. So in fact, the way climate change impacts security, we use the term human security. So in any way that climate change impacts food security, water security, physical security, shelter, anything that has to do with the survival of a human being. And for this session, I'll say a few words about what our office is doing and what we've found in the field. So it's clear that the impact of climate change is different depending on which region you're looking at. And in West Africa and the Sahel, this is one of the driest regions in the world, and especially in the Sahel, which is just beneath the Sahara Desert. So we're talking about a region that is already very vulnerable to environmental shocks, and also a region that has high level of poverty, high level of unemployment. It's a region where more than 50% of the population are youth. And it's a population of 240 million people, half of whom live in one country, Nigeria. And on top of this, this is a region where 60 to 70% of the population rely on agriculture and livestock rearing for survival. So there is this dependence on the land and on the water. And this is important because we're talking not about sort of a separate part of the population, but it concerns everybody. It's also important to note that women make up more than 50% of the agricultural workforce. And even I think UN Women cites that if you take the agricultural workforce and the whole value chain, you'll see that women make up as much as 80%. So the impact of climate change on women is also a very, very important aspect to look at. During the last few years, this office has worked with the whole UN system, with ECOWAS and other regional partners, with civil society, to understand this concept of the impact of climate change on security. And we decided to take a bottom-up approach. And we visited villages in 5 countries in the region, in Senegal and Mauritania, in Niger, Nigeria, and in Liberia. And we asked these communities, not how does climate change impact you, but just more broadly, in the last decade, what have been the challenges to your livelihoods? And so we asked this broad question. And what we found from these interviews with local communities is that in every community where we met with women and men and youth, they were talking about the heat waves, the sandstorms, the lack of rain, too much rain, rain on the wrong season, the droughts and the flooding, and crops being destroyed and land being lost. And with this, the income also being lost. And 3 things really stood out in terms of the link between climate change and security. And again, I'm using this aspect of human security. Many villagers spoke about increased competition over resources, which is one thing I think has been cited a lot. Of course, when climate shocks hit, there will be less access to land and water and more competition over these resources. And I think the most manifest example of that is probably farmer-herder conflict. Then second, there's also this issue of migration, that when it becomes difficult to stay in one place because of climate-induced challenges, people move. And I know I have my colleague Hind here from IOM who will talk more about those aspects. And then a third thing that we also notice is this sense of donor dependence, that there is these are places that are hardest hit by climate change, but also places where they've been receiving support from donors to do certain projects, let's say vegetable gardens. And the more you have climate change, the more difficult it becomes to actually handle these projects. And so I think that there is also a niche there to look at this donor support and also how to support communities to become more self-reliant. I talked about human security. Then in terms of the solutions, and I think we will come to that in the next session, how do you turn these things around? And I think this is where there's just so much hope, because even if these communities talked about the climate change as a major factor impacting their lives, they also talked about the need to look at new ways of working the lands, new crops, new alternative ways of living, new ways of connecting with other communities across the region. And I just completed a workshop with 20 youth innovators from West Africa and the Sahel. And I talked to you a little bit later about what they are proposing as solutions for this. So I'll stop here, and I'm grateful to be talking to you. Thank you.
Excellent, Ngozi. Thank you so much for that. And we're looking forward to drawing out those elements of solution. And the youth angle is very attractive indeed, as we are looking at a very youthful continent in the form of Africa. We now are going to move directly as a bridge from what Ngozi has been saying. And one of the manifestations is, of course, when it gets hard enough for people to be where they are, they have to leave to find better pastures. And in general, this has been a human endeavor for the longest time. It's good when people have positive drivers around this. It is, of course, quite tragic when those drivers are very negative, like the negative impacts of climate change. And to take us much more deeply into this aspect, we have Ms. Hind Banani from the International Organization for Immigration, who will give us her views. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Des, and thank you very much for having me, also, I mean, giving us the opportunity to talk further about this this topic of climate security and in our region. So I'm, as you said, I'm a regional specialist for IOM on migration, environment, and climate change. So my topic of specialty is human mobility in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster. And our office in Dakar, so I'm speaking from Dakar, covers 23 countries of West and Central Africa, let's say from Mauritania to Chad to Congo, Brazzaville, so that you have an idea of where I speak from. Also, just to, as a preliminary remark, also just to say that it's always a bit tricky to talk about human mobility or migration within the climate security nexus. It's of course necessary, it's very important to take into account human mobility, but it's also always, there is also, let's say, a risk to frame it as a risk, because human mobility is not only a risk, it has always been an adaptation strategy and to climate change also. And we are in a region, exactly as my colleague Ngozi just said previously, we are in a region where economies, livelihoods and lives depend a lot on natural resources. So we are in a region where human mobility has always been an adaptation strategy. And also to, as another preliminary remark, reacting to what you just said, Des, and thank you very much for this. It's important also to take into account, to take into account immobility, because climate change can also can also mean immobility and impacting the capacity of populations to move. And when you have you are in conflict areas, it's even more true. So yeah, in terms of human mobility, let's set the scene in the region. So we have human mobility dynamics that are triggered by sudden onset events, and such as floods, but storms also, and landslides. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, at the end of 2021, the region accounted for 265,000 internally displaced persons due to disasters. But these figures, as important as they might be, do not take into account, do not consider slow onset events such as land degradation, water scarcity, coastal erosion, or sea level rise. So it's very important also not to to have qualitative also approaches in terms of research, of data production, to also to understand that there are not only sudden onset events, but also slow onset events that come to add to the different drivers of human mobility. So Ngozi talked about the threats that climate change is for food production, the means of subsistence of the agricultural income of rural households. So we are in economies that depend strongly on on agriculture. And guess what? Who produces agriculture and food? It's a lot of migrants too. And this is a reality that labor migration in the region is extremely important, and extremely important also regarding the environment, because agriculture, mining, and fisheries attract our natural resources dependent sectors, and they also depend on labor migration. So it's very also important to have a look at this labor migration and understand what are the needs of protection and what are the conditions of this population. And also, I just wanted to put a focus on urbanization. You have a colleague at ISS, Emmanuel, who talks a lot about cities in Africa, and I think that also it's very important to have a look at cities, because cities in our region, we have a lot of coastal, but also in landlocked Sahelian countries, cities that are under the pressure of climate change, but also under the pressure of demographics. And it's extremely important to have a look at the needs of the cities, and also to equip the cities to face the challenges, multi-layered challenges that are coming and that are already here, by the way. And also maybe a point on transhumance to end and to conclude this first round. We at IOM, we are developing a tool, a data collection tool that can allow us to understand among the different factors how climate change is impacting in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Mauritania too, how climate change impacts and the mobility dynamics of pastoral communities. And the first results are coming. So I will stop here, and happy to answer any question, if any.
Excellent, Hind. Thank you very much for that first pass. We're very curious about the kind of information that you're already gathering and the trends that are emerging from it, but let's pick that up in the conversation as we go on. Colleagues, we now have Fatten Aggad, and Fatten is an expert on geopolitics. She currently advises on these issues at the African Climate Foundation, and we're quite proud to have an African Climate Foundation because it talks quite directly to the issue that Ngozi had raised earlier around one of those three areas that concerned local communities a lot, is that a lot of the money and much of the agenda is actually donor-driven. We have an opportunity to turn that on its head just a little bit. Fatten, can I invite you to the floor?
Thank you, Des. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to your speakers. Since you introduced slightly the African Climate Foundation, just let me say a couple of things about that. We are the first, I think we're proud of that, the first African climate-focused grant-making foundation. We're relatively new. We've been 2.5 years in the scene. We're headquartered in South Africa, although initially working on and in South Africa. We've in the last year expanded our scope and support to what is currently in 23 African countries, and with some with parts of our team also based in Dakar and some based in Nairobi. And our focus is very much on the climate development nexus. So it speaks very much to the theme of the webinar today. I want to look at geopolitics, but also international cooperation and how that is shaping the debate on climate and security. And I think what we know and what the experts have been clear about is that inaction on climate threats are not only a threat multiplier, but also say a fragility amplifier. And action, I think, on climate is not only indeed on climate is not only within the confines of what is very much seen as climate negotiations that are very much technical, but I think the solutions are very much across sectors, which brings me to the main theme of my intervention today, which is to say that the manner in which we have been approaching climate change has been very silent, and in that sense, this link also, we need to avoid that this link between climate and security itself even further silos that discussion around how to intervene in climate. And I think we need to bring in multiple areas. And so what does that mean? The first obvious elephant in the room, which a lot of people in our field talk about, at least if you work on climate-related issues and intervention, relates to climate finance. It is extremely important. We're not meeting the targets as per the international agreements. And worryingly, what we're seeing is that meeting the climate pledges is currently caught in geopolitical dynamics, with some partners blaming the other partners for not contributing enough. And I think a lot needs to be done in order to meet climate finance promises, particularly around adaptation. I think the challenge in the African continent is not necessarily, for most cases, not necessarily around what's called mitigation, but I think we need to invest into financing. But it's not the Holy Grail. I think climate finance as currently defined is not the Holy Grail. And I think we need to pay also attention to not just finance decision, and we see, for instance, currently extremely worrying trends around putting percentages or associating certain percentages to official development assistance, to say X amount needs to be spent on climate action. The risk of that is that we might see a diversion of resources from other critical sectors that may further amplify security challenges. And so we need to be very careful with that. There's no additionality. We see countries, as we've seen the horrible announcements this week by the UK, dropping substantively its development assistance. We see countries such as Sweden, which have been leaders in development assistance and are playing an important role, slashing the development assistance budget. And in that, then diverting also some of them for climate finance. But what does that mean in terms of areas such as humanitarian assistance? What does it mean for other critical development areas? Is quite, it's important to pay attention to that. So that's on the finance side, but I wanted also to touch on the policy side of things, because a lot of the action has been very much about climate, in the sense that the thinking has been to showcase what kind of climate-related measures could be introduced to showcase commitment around climate that may be relevant in a particular region. Let me take, for instance, the case of Europe, or the European Union in particular, where certain decisions are made and seen as climate action in that particular region, can actually prove to be counterproductive if one looks at the broader scheme of things. Again, the point I was just mentioning now around diverting some of the international cooperation money for climate action is one such example. It does not necessarily contextualize the intervention in broader development issues. So when one speaks, or some of the international partners, as we've seen coming out of the EU, including from Germany this week, saying we need to push for the implementation of, for instance, the Green Deal. let's be clear that implementation of some of the measures under these policy adjustments that are taking place in the case of the EU have proven to be counter, or at least what the specialists are telling us from the modeling that we're seeing, from the quantitative as well as qualitative studies that we're seeing, that the impact can be extremely counterproductive. And I think in some regions that are heavily dependent on international support can even further accentuate this concern around security. The last point that I wanted to add is that all the structural international issues around questions such as food systems, that a decision is not limited in Africa alone. But if we're to discuss food systems, it's about how we operate multilaterally in institutions such as the World Trade Organization, within the UN system, etc. So just to emphasize as a closing point, the need to create linkages, not just between climate, not just with climate and security, but bring in these other factors, these other policy areas, that if we are not careful and not consciously thinking about the coherence of action across these different sectors, we actually risk doing more harm than good. Thank you.
Absolutely excellent. Thank you so much for that, Fatten. It's a quite rich subset of issues that we need to unpack in the discussion. Colleagues, before I introduce our last panelist, I want to emphasize that there is a Q&A function where you can put down your questions. You can also use that as a vehicle to also put in your comments, and we certainly will ventilate that when we come to the discussion part of the session. Next, I'd like to introduce Hector Morales Munoz, who is a senior advisor at Adelphi, and linking back to where Ngozi started, that you've got to bring this down to people. You've got to bring this down to the local level, and he's going to offer some views around some work that they have been doing in West Africa at a much more local level to enrich this debate. Hector, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Desigen, and all my co-panelists. I'm going to share the screen very quickly. Yeah. So just thank you. My name is Hector Morales, and I work as a senior advisor at Adelphi. And what I'm going to present here is part of a field trip research that we conducted together with UNDP Nigeria in the northwest of Nigeria, specifically the states of Sokoto, Zamfara, and Katsina. And the objective of this field trip was to understand more the climate security pathways and mechanisms that are taking place in this violent conflict crisis that is happening there. In this area, there has been many studies in trying to understand the conflict, but we wanted to give a closer look at the climate or climatic factors, and also the ideas and the needs and the opportunities that the people or the strategies that the people are trying to develop to be more resilient to the shocks. So what we have identified when we met with academics, journalists, civil society organizations, and also the governments. And what they reported was that there has been, or they have perceived a really intense, more extreme weather events, specifically droughts and floods, which are two phenomena that are directly attributed to global warming. So higher temperatures are making the soil drier, and when the rainy season comes, the ecosystem cannot absorb the rain, and it has created lots of floods. So these higher temperatures and unpredictable rainfall variability has affected directly the low agricultural productivity And this has created loss of critical ecosystems and infrastructures. And if you sum up these two, or the existing consequences of violent conflict between farmers and herders, and the environmental degradation of deforestation, erosion, desertification, this creates some specific direct effects on the land use and land tenure dynamics. And then through some intermediate variables, it creates conflict risks. So, of course, if there is a loss of critical ecosystems and infrastructure, the livelihoods are being affected. And this, in some with low agricultural productivity, increases food prices and creates food insecurity. There is also a scarcity in grazing pastures and reducing arable land. And in this area, the main land uses existing there are grazing and arable land, and arable land, so in crops. So one grows by itself, the grazing pastures, and are used by the herders, and the arable land has been reduced their capabilities, and this together has altered transhumance patterns, right? So what triggers the conflicts in some cases are how the food prices, the food insecurity create these grievances over lack of food or access to natural resources, and the armed flows and the lack of transnational borders control, especially with Niger, has aggravated existing tensions between farmers and herders. So this is also very common in all of the Sahel, which is how violence escalation over resource access, grazing pastures, and arable land has increased. And particularly in Nigeria, the phenomenon that they call banditry, in which herder communities have been marginalized, has aggravated, and starting from cattle rustling, evolving into kidnapping, extortion, violent attacks to communities, which in turn diminishes the livelihoods loss. So farmers report that it is really hard for them to go to their farms, and also you can perceive a lot of marginalization for the farmer from the herder communities. So, and all of this happens not directly, as I said, there are some intermediate variables, but there is a whole contextual, political, social, and economic factors. And I agree completely with Fatten that this is not just a climate issue, but it's a whole sustainable development issue, and the morals and the political economy happening there. So among the contextual factors of vulnerability and fragility are the lack of essential services in remote areas, such as schools and hospitals. Many herders report that they cannot access Western education, as they call it. There are no capacities on disaster risk reduction, or very minimal in management of emergency responses, even though the Nigeria government has recently created an agency at the national level and is starting to develop the local chapters. And the local governments also reported that there is not enough information systems on the impacts of climate variability on agri-food production, or on preventing action against conflicts happening around land use, for example. So there is also a lack of strategies to adopt climate smart agriculture, for example, and to adapt it without elevating conflict risk through the traditional cultural practices. And the traditional conflict dispute resolution has been also affected. There's a lack of women's participation in decision-making scenarios, lack of youth unemployment, which is critical in this context. And of course, all of these regions are highly dependent on agricultural livelihoods. And also, I forgot to mention, but it's really key in this aspect, the elevated population growth that has affected the land uses, and the food production is not enough for the levels of population growth that has happened in the last 2 decades in Nigeria. So many of the entry points that we found are running around these lines of the contextual factors, but I think that would be the follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Hector. Colleagues, I think what's very clear from the presentations and in all of the analytical work that has been done to date is that we are very genuinely in a climate crisis in the world. But I want to push us, though, because we can't be paralyzed by this crisis, and just borrow on the word from Mandarin to describe crisis, and that's Weiji. And Weiji is, in fact, 2 words, because every crisis has a Wei part, which is the danger, but it also has the G part, which is the opportunity. So can we organize to make lemonade out of these very, very sour lemons that we currently are dealing with in the form of the climate risk on the African continent? And I want to go back to the panel to ask them exactly this question. What are the solutions embedded in this problematique that may well accelerate our pathway as a continent towards sustainable development? And Ngozi, if I can come right back to you, and maybe you can expand a little bit more on that wonderful story you were starting about the youth.
Wonderful, with pleasure. This is actually my favorite session, solutions. And I wanted to just go back because I realized when I put the context, I forgot also to say that obviously West Africa and the Sahel is the hardest hit by climate change, but it's also an environment now where we see a paradigm shift in terms of violent extremism and terrorism. So, it's important to understand the geopolitics of that and how that also impacts the way we can address solutions. And that's why I think from our office, again, we are doing something very unusual because we usually don't go and speak to local communities. We have the habit of going to capitals. So what we're trying to do is to link what we heard from local communities with national and regional policy development. So whether you talk about the NDCs or the national climate change adaptation plans or other climate change plans, and to see how you can integrate a more conflict sensitive approach to that. Because at the end of the day too, I think people are saying, why is there so much focus on security? But we do know that when there is competition over resources, when people move, even though there are positive aspects of it too, as Hind indicated, that it can push people to the brink of having to access water and food and so on. So it's also about dialogue. It's also about resource management. It is about governance. It's about state presence. You have to link all of that. And you have to have an integrated approach, as Fatten said, that, and this is why it's so exciting, but also difficult within the UN system right now, because I work in a political organization, but I now have to have an exchange and cooperation with colleagues who work on the environment, who work on migration, who work on women, who work on youth. And so it requires us to think very differently. And so in a way, climate change has given us an opportunity to go out of that comfort zone and really try to think about new things. And that brings me to this workshop, which we were organizing last week, bringing together 20 youth innovators from this region. And it was a really touching experience to see these youth were coming from primarily rural communities that are extremely impacted by climate change. And they have tried against these odds to come up with new ways. And the driving force of this is jobs, to get a job, to get an income. And so just to give an example, to give some examples, there was one woman from Northern Cote d'Ivoire was trying to reuse cashew nuts, which they usually don't, there's not so much interest in cashew nuts in that region. So she's trying to look at cashew nuts and see how she can develop products out of that. And she brought examples of what she's trying to do and how she's trying to trade with other communities and also across the borders, and how she's even able to recruit young people in her community. There was also a young man who is working on turning recycled materials into tiles that you can build houses with. And also, again, the idea is to recruit youth and so on, to avoid young people leaving, which we've seen leaving across the oceans, which is still happening, to get to those risky travels over to Europe. And also the fact that in the Sahel region, we're still seeing the link between unemployed youth, pushed to the brink and joining violent extremist groups. And there was also a woman who spoke about, from Senegal, the fact of going back to agriculture, because it's not something that is very attractive for young people today to go back to agriculture. It feels like it's the wrong trajectory. And trying to find ways to engage communities to stay where they are. So those are very positive things. And what we're trying to do next is to take all of this to COP27 and to see how we can mobilize attention around this. I mean, obviously there's so much going on, and the stories I'm sharing with you are just some of the things that we are discovering, but there's many, many more things happening. And I think the COP27 would show that as well. So it's about supporting this, young people supporting others who are working for climate adaptation, because in this region, it's really about adaptation. I think this is the truth that one is seeing. It's not so much about mitigation. And also to give hope. And I end on that point because what touched me the most in the conversation with the youth was that they say that the narrative about their future, and especially now with climate change, is so negative. And that as important as it is for them to get finance, they also want to feel supported, encouraged, motivated, and empowered. And I left feeling as surprised actually at how much the negative narrative is playing out on the motivation of young people, trying to do both climate action and peace building.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Ngozi. I'm going to now turn to Hind. And Hind, it's quite a conundrum around human mobility, isn't it? I mean, human mobility has been, in fact, one of the driving forces around developing different regions in the world. The regions that have done really well in the world have actually had the benefit of great minds and diversity from all over the world, in fact. So what are we looking at here? How do we turn to the other side of this challenge coin that the World Bank is saying is going to have enormous numbers? I mean, the number they're using in the Groundswell report is by 2050, there'll be 89 million Africans.
If nothing is done. Sorry.
Yes.
If nothing is done.
If nothing is done. Over to you, man.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So, yeah, just Ngozi, you inspired me a lot when you introduced the solutions. Speaking of the Sahelian communities, and I'm sorry, Ngozi, I'm going to repeat what you've already heard. But when you look at the Sahelian or the communities in West and Central Africa, and we can talk about the Sahel, we are generally talking about the most vulnerable to climate change. But I think that the other side of the coin is that they are the most resilient also. So it means also that solutions are already here, that they are developed, they are being developed also at community level. And it's very important to look at them. It's not, I mean, there is not one solution, and this is not the solution, but it's very important that not that we think out of the box, but that we look out of our boxes, and that we look at what is going on the ground. And from a human mobility perspective, I would also say, to answer your question, Des, that, I mean, of course, there is the migration towards north that needs to be looked at, of course, but 90 to 95% of international migration in West and Central Africa is made within West and Central Africa. So it's very important that first we do address the realities and that we make these realities a priority in terms of human mobility, that we look at internal migration, because the World Bank report you mentioned, it's about internal migration. Let's also remember that at continental level, 6% of the international migration is done, 6%, sorry, of the transoceanic migration is done irregularly. So it's very important also that we also address the actual realities. So just to go back to the solutions, definitely I think it's very important that we look at what is being done and how the communities, for example, in Niger, are facing, I mean, let's say bare hand regarding climate change, and that we also document the knowledges and the know-hows and the strategies that these communities are developing, so that we can also build on it and support and strengthen. And also it's very important, and Hector, you talked about the perception of the communities. So definitely it's very important also to mobilize the perception of communities to feed the policy processes, because it informs decision makers on what are the realities. So perception is not about making, making communities participating in processes just to tick the box, but it's very important that they feed the policy processes. And also that these voices from the ground are heard in forums like the COP27, for example. In terms of solutions also, I think that also partnership is extremely important. Partnership, of course, I mean, Ngozi talked about the UN system, that we de-silo our approaches. Partnership between the humanitarian and the development actors also, it's extremely important that we start building solutions that can support this, the humanitarian development nexus. We all have to learn from each other. And partnership, for example, when we talk about labor migration, labor migrants and farmers, small scale farmers are often, I mean, from the same communities, and they have often the same interests. And it's very important that we think that they are the two sides of the same coin, so that we do not oppose the social right, the social and human rights of labor migrants and the environmental rights of the small-scale farmers and the host communities. So it's extremely important that we think that partnership in every scale of the action. And just to conclude, Ngozi, you talked about, I mean, going back to agriculture. Definitely, I mean, agriculture is not a job for the future anymore, and we can witness this in Europe, but we also witness this in Africa, in our regions, and it's extremely important that we have let's say an innovative look at this. It's not about technologies, it's not about technicity, but it's very, I mean, there are a lot of knowledges and know-hows that have been forgotten. Urban and peri-urban agriculture are disappearing, but they are playing, I mean, they can play a very important role in terms of food security, in terms of also flood resilience, etc. So it's very important that we I don't like the term that we go back to, traditional practices that used to play a very important role, and that we give a new, let's say, look to these practices, because there are still some young people that want to work in agriculture, but they do not have the means, they do not have access to land, they do not have access to water, and it's very important that we support them, and that we also support their leadership regarding these practices that are extremely important for food security, for creating jobs, for also climate security. I will stop here.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Those were really rich points, and I see that the tally of questions is rolling on in the Q&A, which is really excellent. I just want to make sure with our technical folk that we are going to be able to unmute those folk just now and allow them to address the floor. I'm sure you can organize that. I want to now move on to Fatten. Fatten, you put some challenges from a global level, from the donor level, at the local level, around how we need to get out of these silos that are clearly restricting us. What are the core elements of solution in addition to what Ngozi and Hind have already put on the table?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps just before I go to the couple of points that I had, just to emphasize again on what Hind just concluded with, on the need to harness local knowledge. I mean, especially in agriculture, we see it now that we are extremely vulnerable because of dependence, for instance, on crops that are not necessarily indigenous to the African continent. And it's only now that we're actually realizing that it is actually time to bring back some of the traditional crops. It is again time to look at the more traditional knowledge around agriculture. And I think we need to, and I think not just in agriculture, I think we have it in multiple areas. There's a lot of talk, for instance, around isolation in buildings as an approach to reduce consumption of electricity. A lot of those traditional, a lot of that knowledge sits actually with traditional building across the continent, and we see some innovation now happening and being led by some architects across the continent, bringing back that knowledge and reintegrating it. And so just to emphasize that, I think we tend to look outside for technology and know-how, and I think it's time that we again place some value on some of the traditional measures. But to go back to your question, Des, I had two elements. One, which is, I think, can sit with us as Africans, with our leadership. I think that really needs to take some action, and one from an international cooperation perspective. One is around how do we approach the climate issue within our own countries. And I think there's a need to realize that the potential of Africa to play a transformative role in the solution is there. We often talk about the role of natural resources that Africa has for the green transition. The problem with that is that we're still talking about them as from an export lens. We're not talking about them from a value addition, a green industrialization lens within our continent. And I think that move actually needs to happen sooner than later. And look at it also from a regional cooperation perspective. Again, we tend to look at issues such as how do we play a role, a solution, how do we provide a solution as countries for the future? And we tend to look at it as one country taking X measures in its industrial policy, and it's time to connect the pieces within our region. I'd love, for instance, to see DRC cobalt being processed as attempts are being made now in Zambia to some degree. Feeding the car industry in South Africa using Namibian hydrogen. I think that would be such a beautiful, solution, I think, for the future. We have different examples, I think, elsewhere on the continent. And so we need to think beyond the classical approach of export-oriented markets, because we will fall again in the same trap. And in the process, we won't be necessarily creating the wealth that we will need to be able to enable population to provide a space for a small and medium-sized enterprises that can feed into that value chain of this green transition. I think it would be a huge missed opportunity. And my second point was in terms of solution, it's for international partners. I think there are some immediate action if we manage to put the geopolitics aside, which I realize it's ambitious, but I think it's not if we look at the longer term ramifications. It may be difficult if we look at it now, but look at what kind of measures could be introduced. And there, I think if we bring back to the center this notion of a just transition in the international system by providing some leeway, a form of a transition window for countries by, for instance, introducing some forms of exemptions around, we have, for instance, currently in the EU, some new measures which are around climate action, but new measures relevant to the agricultural sector, which are already becoming problematic for countries such as Ghana that depend on exports to the EU for cacao. We have a similar issue for East African countries that depend on their flour exports to the European markets. All of these are jobs, and they're jobs on the ground. So from an international partner point of view, it looks like climate action, but it's not climate justice for the countries, nor is it constructive, including from a security point of view. Because you're touching on jobs, you're touching on livelihoods of people. But if we had a situation where international partners realize that shifting the burden on Africa is unjust, not just that, but in the long term counterproductive, risky, and if there is that realization that we now move towards an exemption model supported by an agenda around the transition, and again, with this realization again from our own countries that we need to move beyond an export market. I think with that, I think the international partners can play an important role in providing a solution by allowing and supporting a clear transition towards a more sustainable model.
Sorry, I've been talking to myself. Now we're going to switch to Hector. Hector, your elements of solution, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, I've been really happy to hear this fascinating intervention from Fatten, Hind, and Ngozi. And I think, Fatten, you really touch on many points that are crucial to enable this transition. And one of the things that sometimes are left out in the discussion on climate security is this paradox, between economic development, if you like to say, to overcome poverty, and climate mitigation and adaptation. So I agree with you that in most countries of the global south and in Africa, especially, mitigation is not the priority. However, which kind of development model are the policymakers chosen to continue development? So still, this is a crucial question, and it's really interesting that you frame it into this transitional agenda. So from the case study that I presented, one of the things that we found is that there is an opportunity for working together with communities in some local models of where communities start developing alternatives for adapting to the extremes weather events that are happening right now. For example, collecting information. So this approach is also known as citizen science, but how communities can develop these environmental monitoring groups where they collect scientific information, so to say, like data, but not also collect the data, but they can elaborate on this data, so they can do advocacy and put it up there in tables or within natural resource management committees. So these kind of actions can also have a co-benefit for social cohesion and peace building. This is known in environmental peace building as the contact hypothesis, where when conflicting parties come together, or just a community come together to a common purpose, they start developing a shared identity, and this creates like a community of practice. And what this also contributes to is that now the communities have this sort of technical data to advocate, for example, around quality of water, etc., etc. So all of this information on resilience can inform the different development models. So around what kind of land uses can happen, how can you restore different ecosystems or water access points, which is also at the same time a source of jobs for youth and for communities. So if there is a policy from the government where missions to restore different ecosystems are happening, then it can also raise the resilience, raise up the resilience from the natural barriers. So, for example, if you start reforesting some areas, this takes time, so it has to be financed sustainably. But then the ecosystems recover the capacities to absorb the water in the rainy season, and this also contributes to the soil fertility. So I noticed that some panelists were talking about how can you overcome poverty without agricultural production, and so I also agree with Fatten when she said that there are still so many food systems that are built on the colonial heritage of cash crops or just monocultivation, which needs to be overcome to reach food sovereignty or food security as long as it is possible. But also diversifying the economy should be important, and also the examples that Ngozi mentioned. I noticed that the youth in Africa, in many areas of the global south, and with the people that we talk in Nigeria, they're very interested in, for example, this intersection between digital solutions and agriculture, or digital solutions and monitoring ecosystems. So some other options, such as payment for ecosystem services, could be developed. And yeah, but at the very local level, building these information systems on resilience can help put some communities together. And yeah, other things is, for example, that are more policies at the regional level. For example, the energy matrix, and how sustainable energy can be deployed, and see what is the opportunity for the minerals, the mining industry in Africa, and if this is still an alternative for development, how this should be managed so it doesn't create further conflicts, and how it can be managed so there is an overcome of the corruption dynamics around these kind of industries, etc.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hector. Colleagues, I'm going to open up a bit to the floor. There are a couple of people who have asked to speak, which is really excellent. As always, time is something that we have to fight with. So I'm going to ask for the folk who take the floor to really restrict their comment or their questions to a minute or so that we have a chance for the panelists to respond before we close. So I'm going to start with Marcello Gerlach, please. If you could unmute, please, the technical folk. And Marcello, you have the floor.
Okay, can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for your input. It's very interesting. I was asking myself, I work also in climate topics and will be supporting for 3 years youth-led organizations in the Sahel region, and mostly working with young people, with local partners. So yeah, maybe, yes, from your experience, this bottom-up approach, what is the most maybe important when approaching young people? It's about governance, about policies, but how not to overwhelm them with these technical issues, as you mentioned before. What are your biggest challenges from your own experience? And maybe the last question is more sensitive. It's about maybe violently suppressing any kind of social ecological activism, which is happening in some countries. So how to work such a sensitive topics as ecological activism if the country itself is very suppressive. So there is this, I hope you understand my question. Thank you.
We do indeed. Thank you. Rather a piercing set of questions, actually. Excellent, Marcello. We can now go to Roel Ryland, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Roel Ryland. Thank you. I'm from Luxembourg, from the Luxembourg government. Currently in the Directorate of Defense, but before I spent many years in West Africa, in Niger, in particular, and also in Burkina Faso, covering our development cooperation, running our development cooperation out of there. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion and the proposals. Regarding the question of agriculture, I think agriculture will be for the foreseeable time a very important source of revenue in West Africa, in the Western Sahel, and not only agriculture, but also cattle breeding. And I think we should look, there are a number of very concrete bottom-up initiatives that we should look at, and we should see which work on a very small scale often. And I think we should look at those ones and try to multiply them, and maybe also with additional funding to increase their scope. I'm going to mention one that we have supported in Burkina Faso, a project in the northern area, which is a bit difficult accessible now, reclaiming degraded land, rehabilitating degraded land. It was a local NGO initiative that we have then come to support with additional funding. And to my knowledge, for the time being, we have recuperated some 15,000 hectares of pastoral lands. And there has also been some links also to try to link it to the carbon markets, so generate carbon credits. By this kind of project, you help to bring in, reclaim additional lands for people, for herding, but you also, and you improve microclimates, but you also, and that's the most important, you need to find a way that the governance of these lands works, so that the different communities living around the lands, that they agree on a governance, sustainable governance system of the land, so that the effort has not been, how can I say, without results. So this would be my suggestion. I can paste you a link to this project,
Yes.
and maybe it would be interesting to go and look for these very concrete initiatives and try to bring them up, to bring them to the discussion, more than just talking about the problems.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rol. And thank you for giving us a picture of Burkina Faso, which is quite different from what has dominated the headlines for the last week or so. Next, can we go to Joe Morley Davis, please? Okay, if we can't find Joe, then David Murondi.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, Joe, we can hear you now.
Hi. Actually, I asked two questions, but the main one I would like to ask is what measures, if any, are being taken, can be used to basically take into account the impact of hybrid warfare and great power competition, which is kind of directly impacting abilities by local communities to adapt to climate change by eroding their trust in international bodies and partners?
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. That's a very big question. Can we now go to David Murondi?
I think it was David speaking.
Yeah, thank you very much to the panelists for the exciting presentations. It is really good to hear contributions from your experiences. But I have a few questions which I put in the chat. The first one is when I look at all the presentations, I don't seem to see soil fertility being talked about. And I'm asking myself, is soil fertility not also a contributing factor, or a factor that also is related to how people cope with the climate change? Because to me, climate change does not only mean droughts, it also means floods and so on, cyclones. So I don't know whether we have some studies or some experiences on that. And also I got what Benani talked about, that agriculture is no longer a job in the near future. Then I see the masses who depend on it. How do they work themselves out of poverty? Perhaps there could be some models or some case studies which have been tried, which show how people can do away with agriculture in a way which does not compromise their livelihoods. Those are the two comments that I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Where are you from, David?
I'm in Mozambique.
Mozambique.
Yes.
All righty. Oh, most welcome. Thank you, sir. Next, we have Saad Ibrahim. And then, Alex, if you can't locate Saad, then the next person is Yente Michaels. And thank you, Rol, for the link. Excellent. All right, colleagues. Maybe those colleagues are having difficulty getting on. So Yente, you want the floor? No, maybe there's a difficulty around that. It says you are unmuted. No, Yente, we can't hear you yet. Alex, is that something we can repair?
No, this would be on the other side. So
Okay.
there's the
All right.
ability, but yeah, let's keep going.
No problem. Then, colleagues, thank you so much for those inputs, and those questions were incredibly rich, and some of them very big questions indeed. I'm now going to turn over to the panel, and panel, your brief is to answer or respond to some of the comments, but also include your closing remark. So Ngozi, if I can begin once again with you, please, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Desigan, and thanks again to this wonderful panel. It's been a pleasure, and also to the questions asked. I think on Marcelo's question about the youth approach, and also ecological activism, at least what I heard, as I said, I just came from this workshop with 20 youth from the region. And I was surprised to hear that what they said was they felt very alone in the work that they were doing in their local community on innovation to find ways to address climate change. And so I think, but then they said social media has really been a breakthrough in that sense. And so I think that this idea of empowerment and motivation and connection, and I know that there are all these tools available, including something called Youth Connect. And so I think it's very important for youth to feel like they're connected across, within the country and across the region and what they're doing. And maybe that is also something that will strengthen their courage to address this ecological activism we were talking about. Then on the question about concrete bottom-up activities, definitely, I think, you know, this forum we have today, there's not enough space to actually talk about all these projects and initiatives that exist. And I think we will see at COP27, there will just be a plethora of existing ongoing activities that are bottom-up. And I'm, you know, delighted to hear that in Burkina Faso, which is, it's really hard hit now by terrorism, that this is working. I think that the challenge is always this idea of scaling up and sustainability. And it's important, again, I think that when you talk about bottom up, that it's connected to the national level and also to the regional level, because I think the region is facing, at least in West Africa, are facing the same challenges, the same trends. And so the more you can have a regional approach to things, the better. On the cyber warfare question, I leave that with Fatten, because that's geopolitics for her. And then on soil fertility, I think definitely the person from Mozambique, I want to give, we also went to visit local communities in the border, in the coastal areas of Liberia. And they were talking about the sea level rise and the flooding they were dealing with, and this involuntary relocation that they were doing increasingly now every year because of climate-induced flooding, and how they were trying to re-fertilize the soil afterwards. There's a lot of work, I think, to do in that area, but definitely it is a contributing factor, and it is, I think, at the end of the day, we're talking about the land and the water. Those are the foundation, if you want, of addressing these climate change issues. And how to move from poverty to move out of poverty if you don't do agriculture. And I think if I understood Hind right, it's that youth themselves feel like moving to agriculture is a step backwards, because I guess we all feel like as we move forward, we want to go to the cities, we want to, and so on. But I think that there is, and this is what I sense, that there is this movement now of young people, of women, of men, of trying to do something new to mix local knowledge and techniques, and also bringing in modern, modern technologies, and to see how to turn things around and using, as Hector was saying, a digital technology. I'll stop there, but I think that there's just so many opportunities, and we are just a small panel today. There's so many things that exist, and maybe for next time, this again, we could have a panel where we talk about all the wonderful things that exist and how we can build on it.
we will definitely take you up on that. And Ngozi Amu, thank you so much indeed. Now we can move to Hind, please.
Thank you very much for these difficult questions, by the way. I mean, they are very broad and important, and it shows how, I mean, this climate security nexus is extremely broad, and the importance also to de-silo. Yeah, so I won't answer the questions, the technical questions on energy, on agriculture either, but what comes to my mind here is, first of all, autonomy. It's very important. I mean, regarding the energy sector, regarding the food sector, regarding the agriculture sector, the fisheries, it's very important to think the public policies and the local also projects or the local intervention, how we do strengthen the autonomy of communities, of regions, of states towards I mean, the autonomy in general, let's say. And I'm personally, I'm Moroccan, and I don't know if you've heard, but we are living an unprecedented drought this year. And we keep on, I mean, we keep on exporting tomatoes that are full of our water. So it's extremely important that we take into account the environmental situation when we develop policies, when we develop our food security also policies, so that we, I mean, mitigate the risk of being dependent and being out of resources. The other thing about youth, I think, I mean, the question on the environmental activists is extremely difficult, but the message I want to convey is that when we talk about youth and with youth, it's very important to never forget also the intergenerational dialogue. If we want to build and strengthen and innovate the traditional knowledges that, I mean, again, speaking from, I mean, I'm not speaking from Morocco, but as a Moroccan, I know that, of course, we didn't, I mean, we were not a power in terms of economic power, in terms of agricultural production at international level before. But the farmer communities, the local communities contributed for centuries to preserve very important and precious aquifer resources so far. But so we need to build on this. So if we stop, if we do have like a very siloed also approach of youth, and we do not include this intergenerational dialogue, we miss something. And the last point would be more about environmental policies, maybe. Let's try to not make them top down. I mean, it's very important to include the communities, these very communities that have contributed to protect, to preserve the resources. I'm thinking of, for example, in the equatorial forest. Here on the continent, there is what we call a huge problem. This is the problem between elephants and men, let's say humans, we are sometimes in situations where populations are confronted to, are facing very difficult situations because of top-down environmental policies, and we do not have any solutions, and we are criminalizing also sometimes the population at local level regarding the environment. So it's very important that we have this bottom-up approach of environmental protection, but not, I mean, excluding these very populations that have contributed to preserve, to live with the environment, excluding them from the protection of environment. And so it's, I will conclude on this point. I guess I've been long, but thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed. Fatten, are you going to avoid Joe's question on the hybrid warfare and the great powers?
I think I'm left with the most controversial ones. No, there are two. There's this one, and there's the one on ecological activism, which I also wanted to pick up. I think on the point of Joe, on what does this mean for the eroding trust also in the international system? I think it is already there, if I'm honest. I think the trust at different levels, not just at the level of local communities, but even if one looks at the political elite, the decision makers, many also among civil society themselves, etc. I think there's a serious issue in the trust of the international system at the moment, partially driven by these geopolitical fights. I mean, including in the Sahel West Africa region, but not only. That's kind of, I would say, acting as a diversion from the question of, or a diversion from the need for us as a global community to actually make this shift, because of the situation of climate change altogether. So we're seeing that already coming into the discussion of climate change. If you speak to local communities who would tell you, and maybe let me actually link this to the ecological activism point, and I'll be a bit controversial. I'm using my personal hat, but to take the example of local communities who are on the one hand asked to, some of them view it as sacrifice their development. At the time where the Western Hemisphere in particular has historically polluted, and therefore led us, I think, in many ways to the situation we're in. When you're in WhatsApp, a lot of things circulate, and as it were, just this morning, I got a message from with this clip of President Obama. And this is, by the way, information that's not necessarily generated by Africans, but generated by some, trolls, I would almost say, work operating, in the interest of these geopolitical fights. I won't name where it's coming from, but it's coming from a particular Asian country. It's not China. But I received this message with a clip from a speech of President Obama a few years back, basically saying, if Africans are addressing Africans in particular, if you want to develop at the same pace as the Western world, you will not. It's not sustainable for the planet. And this has been interpreted as, well, look, they developed and they're now trying to get us developed. Because of that mistrust again, there's a context. It's not void of any history there. But people see it as, oh, okay, so they developed, now they're telling us we can't develop at that point. So you have these beliefs who are at different levels clashing with beliefs that we actually need action around climate. That some of the resources needs to be used wisely, and you would know that there's a lot of discussion, for instance, around critical minerals, around the issue of gas at the moment, and people realize that if you oppose a particular use of a resource, not opposed, but if you're a bit more critical because of the changes, the environmental impact on local communities themselves, and you realize you want to push for that, because of this mistrust, and you have this other group, you're then in a situation of clash where people then would accuse, you know, the one or the other for being a tool to another group. So to be honest, we're already seeing it manifesting itself, and very strongly so, in the environmental space. The question of gas, for instance, and it would be my last point, perhaps, this again, is one that is very much recurring. Maybe let me not take gas; it's a bit controversial. But the question around critical minerals, cobalt, and you know, the DRC, where people see it as a space for geopolitical competition. Again, I think from an environmental activism point of view, you know, there's a lot there that needs to be said about how resources are exploited. Is it beneficial for the local community, or is it, you know, for the purpose of other interests? And then you have the economic kind of interests. You have, and again, it clashes, and then it becomes about, not necessarily about the country and its population, it becomes about the geopolitical clash between the US and China. And so these are realities. I think the best approach to tackling this is around information, it's around dialogue, it's around understanding where different parties come from. I would agree with Hind. I think a lot of these, you know, for instance, reactions by local communities have been criminalized, without necessarily taking into account some of the dynamics and some of the realities, the lived realities of people in terms of needs. And we need to move beyond that. So I think in organizing advocacy, I think we need to take into account this political economy, but keep the people's interests at heart. And I feel sometimes it's forgotten.
Fantastic. Then Hector, the last word from the panel belongs to you. I'm going to rush you a little bit because we're now over our time. We're starting to lose some people.
No, I think yeah, many things have been said, and I just want to to echo what Fatten said about this tension between geopolitical situations and the development opportunities of the global south in general. And I think we need to be more organized on activism and on I think David Muronda was saying that are there any development models that can lift people out of poverty and the trade-offs with a cleaner development path? So I do think that we don't need to follow this industrialization path, high intensive or high carbon emissions industrialization path. There is no need for that. So, and we have an advantage, and is that in areas where there is no infrastructure, then you can step up and then develop a greener kind of infrastructure. And also the standards of living shouldn't be the same as I don't know, the California mansions and 7 lanes highways. I don't know if that is a need for everyone, you know. So these kind of discussions need to be taken into account, like these sustainable ways of life. But on the other points, so I think it's really critical to have integrated programming and approaches, so to address climate security. So climate adaptation is part of the solution. However, all of these technical, for example, climate smart agriculture or technical approaches, wouldn't have any grip if they are not embedded in conflict prevention, conflict transformation mechanisms, the governance part. So there is a great opportunity for where discussions, for example, around land use from a technical point of view, it can open dialogue spaces without leaving the political factors behind, but it open dialogue spaces. But you need to have the integrated approach. So you not only have the technical solution, but you also enhance negotiation capacities for advocacy, and putting these big questions there on the political economy, the models that are happening in the sub-regions of the continent. Yeah, and also this answers a little bit this question of the hard security approaches. So how much, if you take it from a development point of view, it's not only that if you elevate livelihoods, then this contributes to peace building, but you're also are developing reconciliation processes, or within the dialogue processes, you take into account climate adaptation strategies. In Nigeria, I hear a lot that people wanted also, we need to reconcile with the environment somehow, because all of these pressures have also taken a toll on the ways people relate to the environment. The most clear example was cutting the trees and shrubs closer and closer to the cities. That it didn't happen that way before, but because of the conflict dynamics, this has elevated. So yeah, an integrated approach is needed, and these soft skills, if you want to say it, need to be deployed in the climate adaptation and land use strategies.
Thank you very much, Hector, and thank you very much, panel. That has been a really, really rich discussion, and thank you for the other attendees for your invaluable contributions. And if I can force some conclusions here, the first is that clearly from what we're saying, the challenge is very large, and it requires a lot more effort and a lot more research to understand it a lot better. But we are also saying that it's pushing us in the direction that may well result in a much better sustainable development strategy for the continent as a whole. But there are some important conditionalities. One is where we have to engage what that timetable issue is. It's not straightforward. Secondly, there's the issue of how we deal with indigenous knowledge and build on the repositories that can clearly help us go in the direction that we need to go. We do want to use a value addition lens, and I think this is critically important. And definitely, we do not want to repeat the same pathway that the developed countries have walked through. After all, this is why we're globally in the mess that we are. But the crux at the bottom of this is we need to have much better capacity, much better capability, much better agency, and a really innovative African climate governance system. Colleagues, you have all been brilliant. I thank you all very, very much for attending this session. Thank you.